Okay, so we've been talking during the warm-up about 1950s culture and the sexism and the racism that are inherent there. But let's talk a bit more about the society sort of broadly. So to begin with, I want to introduce you to a term, or maybe reintroduce you to a term, the military-industrial complex. And this is actually coined by President Dwight Eisenhower. Here's a bit of a speech. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. So this is Eisenhower's sort of farewell address. He's leaving office. He's elected in 1952, and he'll serve 2 terms. How could he lose, right? The general who almost literally saved the world. Eisenhower was a Republican, but incredibly centrist. He refused to dismantle the Democratic programs of what remained of the New Deal and the so-called Fair Deal under Truman. He's not going to engage in this partisan warfare. In short, he is one of my favorite presidents for really focusing on what's good for the country above what's good for his party. But anyway, so as he's leaving, he talks about the growth of this military-industrial complex. Remember, one of the things that propels America into this economic boom in the 1950s, significantly greater even than the boom of the 1920s, it's going to be the fact that although the war is over, we never stop spending for war, right? American military spending hardly decreases at all after the war is over, right? The decreases come in the form of fewer troops to support, right? As many of those who are drafted, their terms will expire and they'll go back into their everyday lives. But in terms of the weapons we're developing, the munitions we're stockpiling, the technology we're developing, the active duty members who are on constant guard 24 hours a day, those things don't ever go back down from war levels, right? The submarine, patrols of American waters are never going to stop. The same level at which they were patrolling during the war itself, they're going to continue doing that, and in some cases they're going to increase the rate at which they're patrolling during the Cold War, because we feel like we always have to be on our guard to be sure that we're able to defeat the Soviets. We've got the growth, I might have this later in the presentation, the growth of nuclear stockpiles. The Russians will eventually have more nukes than we do. They explode their first, we exploded an A-bomb, an atom bomb, during the war. So the Russians will explode an H-bomb in 1947. And then it is an understatement, perhaps, to say that we freak the flip out, right? We are really upset. First of all, it took us the entire war with bazillions of dollars poured into this program to develop our own nuclear weapon, and now they've got it within 2 years, and as far as we know, and as far as we know even now, they had done almost no work at all on an atom bomb during the war itself, for understandable reasons. They were too busy trying to not die under the onslaught of the Nazi army. So how did they get the bomb so fast? Well, the answer must be espionage, right? There have to be spies. And so then there's this notion of what secrets are we getting out? If they have nuclear weapons, what can we do? And of course, their weapon, I just told you, it's an H-bomb as opposed to an atom bomb. You guys know that my understanding of physics is extraordinarily limited. But anyway, apparently, the smaller the thing it is that you split. So if you go from splitting a large atom to splitting a hydrogen atom, which is of course the smallest, you get more energy. The boom is bigger. And so they have an even more powerful weapon than we do, so that of course we have to make more weapons. The Soviets will eventually make more than we do, but ours are more powerful. We eventually will have the best technology in terms of the biggest boom in the smallest package, the best delivery system. So our ICBMs tend to be better, our intercontinental ballistic missiles tend to be better than the Soviets, that kind of thing. Anyway, so this military-industrial complex, these defense industries that had sprung up during the war are not really going to go away. And Eisenhower, as he leaves office, he tells the American people, be careful. These companies have an incredible amount of power, right? They influence the government. They not only are influenced by the government, they receive government funds, but they also have a large say in the kinds of policies we're making. The things they develop are going to color our political and military strategy as we go forward. Be careful of this military-industrial complex. And to be honest, I don't know that we really heeded his advice particularly well. But Eisenhower, even the great military general that he was concerned at how this militarization of American government had really proceeded, and he worried for what that would mean for the United States in the future. Okay, so here we go. So I could have shown this. So you're seeing here military spending. All of this adjusted for inflation, so you're not seeing inflationary values here. So, after the war, our spending will decline initially, right? We're getting rid of all those soldiers, all that business, but almost immediately is going to jump back up to an incredibly high level, especially when you consider that this was a level of military spending before the war began, right? So way down here. And throughout the Cold War, we're going to be spending at these really massive amounts. Which will drive our economy and economic boom. It drives the South, right? A couple of things going for the South at this time. So we're moving from the so-called Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. So the Rust Belt would be like Detroit and Philadelphia, this sort of like old Northwest. It had been the industrial center for our country. But as though many of those heavy industries decline in favor of more consumer technologies, we're also going to see a physical shift of the focus of industry to the South. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, land and labor are cheaper in the South, right? The South doesn't allow unions. Can you imagine? We don't have unions in Texas, well, not by any realistic stretch of the imagination. No unions in the South, so wages are lower. Segregated labor forces make it a little bit complicated, but still, you've got lots of minorities in the South, African Americans especially, but also Hispanics, who are willing and used to taking lower wages. Plenty of available land, again, low land costs, property costs. And then there's this. During the war itself, we have to develop a whole bunch of ships and tanks and airplanes, but to get them anywhere, we have to get them to a port, right, to get them to wherever else in the world. Well, there's only so many deep water ports we've got in the Northeast, right? So anything that's going to be developed in the Old Northwest would have to be shipped, to New York or to New Jersey or perhaps Virginia, maybe Boston. And there's a limited number of places that they can really get these big cargo ships in to fill them up. But in the South, we've got lots of really good ports, right? So we've got New Orleans, and Houston, Galveston are sort of the ones that we might be familiar with, but there are many of those on the Gulf Coast, as well as in the Atlantic Seaboard, in Georgia and all around Florida. So the South is going to be a really attractive place to put a lot of defense industries. Also, something really, really important has developed, y'all. It's air conditioning. Nobody wants to live in this house without air conditioning, y'all. But air conditioning is going to help that process, and so the South will see an economic boom during the war itself, as well as afterwards, where the South's economy is going to be much more diversified. Remember I told you we wouldn't hear anything about the South, really, from 1877 to after the war? Well, here we are after the war. And now the South is not going to just be same old sharecropping and agriculture. We're going to be moving into a more diversified Southern economy. The discovery of oil is going to help as we go. So I told you that the U.S. wanted to really avoid the kind of economic recession we had seen after the return of the soldiers from World War I. And one of the policies that Congress proposes to do this is the GI Bill. So GI stands for government issue, and it was sort of like a slang term for the soldiers, right? So all the soldiers were given all these government issue uniforms, government issue whatever. So they were the GIs. And so the GI Bill, or the American Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which was passed just towards the end of the war, 1944, I think. Anyway, it's going to open a few things. So first of all, it's going to provide free college tuition for returning veterans. It's going to provide low-rate guaranteed home and business loans to try and encourage and improve the lives of those returning veterans. So the idea was that even if the soldiers can't get a job, like if we don't have, it takes a while for our economy to adjust to like reincorporate all these soldiers, well, they could go to school. And so they won't be like sitting around, getting angry at the government trying to stage some kind of bonus march or whatever. Additionally speaking, the availability of home loans, we want to help to like ease that crisis of homelessness that had occurred during the Great Depression, to make sure that everybody is sort of going to be able to not only have their own home, but don't forget, when you have a home, I can tell you from personal experience, there are lots of things you have to buy for that home, right? Feeding into that consumerism buzz that we're going to need to support our economy. And then loans for businesses. We want to make sure that veterans who want to, can't find their own jobs, maybe they want to start their own businesses. That's good for the capitalist economy. Sounds like the American dream. All those things are possible. But here's what I want to tell you. This is game-changing for the United States in the sense that it's going to create a huge middle class, right? You own your own home, you can start your own business, you have a college degree. That's the hallmark of today's middle class. And that was not a reality for many people at all before the GI Bill, before the end of World War II. But after World War II, now we see masses of people who have the means to achieve this sort of like middle class status, to achieve this sort of comfortable life. They've got the house, the car, the 2.2 kids, and all of those things are going to change the way politics work. Middle class people are much less likely to support what we would consider to be like extraordinarily liberal policies, because you just get a little bit more conservative when you have a house and kids and you just want to like keep things the same. They're going to help to idealize this American nuclear family, as was pointed out earlier, this notion that like, a king in your own castle, you've got your, picture windows and your, picket fence outside. All of those things are culturally impactful as well as socially and economically impactful. Here's a look at what's going on via college enrollment. So you can see here enrollment was very low all the way through. So here's the 1860s, the 1870s, and so on. And then we get into the 1940s, and all of a sudden we are going to see this really significant boom in college enrollment, which is really where we are today. Technology itself is going to define and change the way that Americans live. Of course, television is going to be a big part of that. We thought that mass culture was a big deal with the advent of the radio. Television is going to take that even a step further, because not only are we hearing all the same voices, but we can see them. Modes of dress, the way people dress, are going to be increasingly homogenized, because we are all going to see the same icons on television. Yes. Yep. Well, you'd only get full tuition to a public university, but private universities, there was government assistance available, student loans, government grants for GIs, those kinds of things. Good question. I should mention, of course, the GI Bill is available for African American soldiers as well as white soldiers. So minorities are allowed to access these benefits, but you should put an asterisk there, right? Because the kinds of schools that are going to be willing to accept students of color, they're not going to be accepted into most mainstream universities, so they're going to be forced into these like traditionally black colleges or into trade schools. Minority veterans are able to access home loans and so on, but the National Housing Authority is going to support and in many cases enforce redlining of communities where certain communities would not sell to any people of color, sort of enforcing on a federal level like residential segregation, which will then result in persistent educational segregation, right? Even today, there's no segregation, officially speaking, in our schools, right? But I bet that you can name an elementary school that is predominantly made up of students of color, can't you? Think of it. You don't have to say it out loud, but you can think of one, can't you? An elementary school in our community that has predominantly people of color. I bet you can think of an elementary school that is almost entirely white, can't you? Yeah, you can. And that's because of residential segregation. There are no laws. College Station ISD is not trying to like segregate kids and keep them apart. That's not the point. But because people tend to live in the place that they've lived before, because you tend to move into a neighborhood where you're going to be with people who are like you, residential segregation then results in educational segregation, because unless we want to bus kids, move them out of their neighborhood and take them across town to some school to have some blended schools, you're going to end up with schools that are very different. And that's sort of a lasting legacy of this time period, because the United States government was in many ways, through the Federal Housing Authority, an instigator of some of those patterns. Not that it hadn't existed before, but the GI Bill could have been an avenue of integration. It could have been a way where we now, in these new communities, these new suburbs that are developing, we could have seen the blending of families of all races, but we didn't. And so instead of making the problem better, it made it worse. And we have to contend with that now. There are, of course, other technologies, lots of convenience technologies, things like the refrigerator, which is going to mean that we have mass-produced foods are going to be have greater variety. The vacuum cleaner, the washing and machine and the dryer, all of those kinds of convenience goods. The rise of computers, because believe it or not, that is a computer. Well, that's the control panel for the computer. The computer itself would have been an entire room's worth. And it would have worked about as fast as your 4-function calculator. That's the processing speed of those ginormous computers. So we've come a long way, y'all. But nevertheless, computing was a big step forward from calculating everything by hand, right? And so we're going to see big advances in technology and in the fields of math and science. Because of the increased computing power. We see medical advances, right? So we're going to see the rise of a vaccine for polio, which up to that point had been an incredible scourge on the nation. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt himself had been a victim of polio, which had paralyzed him. Many children were paralyzed. People who got polio, those who were lucky were like Roosevelt, who were simply paralyzed from the waist down, perhaps. But some would be paralyzed from the neck down. They'd be an iron lung, so an iron lung. Sort of kept on life support sort of perpetually, right? They're like a head with a body that doesn't function. So the advent of a polio vaccine is a huge deal. There were massive vaccination campaigns. I'm getting older. Your grandparents, probably not your parents anymore, my parents, but not yours. Your grandparents probably, if you ask them, will have a smallpox vaccine scar. It's a sort of round-looking scar. Because what they would use is they'd prick them a bunch of times in a circle with this needle that was that had a particular, excuse me, polio. I said smallpox, I think. And that would help to, and then it would sort of crust over and make this big scab, and then they would be immune after that point. So lots of new technologies. And then, of course, there's the baby boom. I don't know how to put this delicately, so I'll just say it like this. The soldiers have been gone a long time, away from their wives, men away from women. They get home, and babies are born 9 months later. And in fact, babies continue being born. A lot of this has to do, so we sort of can understand the initial reasons for a baby boom, the same reason why there are many baby booms after like major power outages and snowstorms. But this is going to continue throughout the 1950s for lots of reasons. First of all, it is culturally advantageous for families, right? Like children are almost status symbols. It's something that is desirable. It's portrayed as something that the community wants you to have. So that's going to, encourage people to have more children. Unlike today, right, where families that have more than 2 children, it's kind of like, wow, are you trying for another girl, or are you trying for a boy, or whatever it is. So these days, like having more than 2 children is sort of seen as a bit like off-putting. Like why would you do that? But culturally speaking, but in the 1950s, again, children are this status symbol, and so we want to encourage families. Remember that babies, I also have personal experience here, really expensive. You have to buy a lot of stuff for these tiny little human beings. And so that's going to help encourage the national economy. And that sort of feeds into itself. When the economy is doing well, when families have plenty of money, we've got our houses, we've got all this business, that's going to also make families feel like they can really they can afford to have children. So you can see this like huge population bubble, and so these baby boomers, which are shown there in orange. And the baby boomers are affecting our society even today, right? Like now what we're worried about is Social Security, because the baby boomers, this big bubble in our population, our demographics, are getting to retirement age, and there are more of them than there are of us, well, me, and soon to be you, the working population paying into things like Social Security. So how are we going to like manage all of that? But in any case, it's going to push consumerism. We also see the rise of really famous like Dr. Spock and his baby book, right? There's this famous pediatrician, and he's going to be writing advice to mothers about exactly how they should rear their children. And so it becomes a science, right? Again, women are supposed to go home and stay home, so what do they do with themselves? They become experts in child rearing and all of these scientific or pseudoscientific ways to raise their children. Of course, they fed children like Coca-Cola to solve the kids' like gas problems, and encouraged. One of the articles I've read in a journal of pediatrics talks about the benefits of television for children. That this is good stimulation. Women, mothers should encourage their children to watch television. I'm not sure that's a problem anymore. So the suburbs are going to become another cultural phenomenon. And interestingly, the suburbs are made possible by things like the GI Bill, but also are going to be made possible by the rise in auto manufacturing, right? Many of those factories which had been producing tanks, for example, for the war effort, are now going to be easily reconverted to producing cars. Americans have more money. Remember that during World War II, we had a really high savings rate, so we have plenty of available capital. Americans who had been saving their money throughout the war when there were very few consumer goods available. So we've got lots of people who are buying automobiles. And of course, if you have a car, that means you can live further from the city, right? Remember why the cities got so concentrated in the first place? This notion that you had to be able to live, you had to be able to get to work every day, so you had to live pretty close. Well, now with more and more people being able to access automobiles, they can live further and further away from the cities. We see urban sprawl, which is a pretty rough thing. These days we're trying to reverse that. I think it's going to be difficult for us to do. But so they move further and further away. But I would argue that this also serves to extra slumify the cities, right? Because who can't move to the suburbs? The people who are poor, right? If you're among the few who can't afford a car or who can't get a loan for a house, well, then you're stuck in the city center. So now the city centers are going to have fewer of those sort of upwardly mobile, upper, lower, and lower middle class people, and more of this sort of like underclass of Americans who are left out of this mass culture. That's the interesting thing about mass culture, is that those who are left out feel extra marginalized, right? If there's lots of diversity in society, then you don't feel as different if you don't happen to fit like the majority norm. But when the whole society seems to all group together and be in this one focus, those who don't quite make it in are truly marginalized in a big way. So I mentioned this before, the movement from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt, gay air conditioning. We've talked in the one about pop culture. And the interesting thing is that the reality is in many ways accurately reflected by pop culture. Things like the focus on the nuclear family and the baby boom and consumer culture, the rise of celebrity culture, around the television and movie stars and all that business. But also, reality begins to challenge this vision of pop culture. We talked in the warm-up about Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique. Are women all quite so happy to be June Cleaver vacuuming in their heels and their pearls? Questions about the rise of teen culture. So this huge number of young people in the 1950s are going to turn into teenagers, Lord help us all, in the 1960s, right? So we're worried about a whole bunch of old people right now. Can you imagine a whole bunch of young people, a bunch of extra teenagers? We're going to begin to see some challenges to society there. The image of Desi and Lucy, which by the way was a really big deal. This is an interracial couple on national television, can we just say? But also they sleep in separate beds because we can't get too racy. So the reality, I think, can be questioned. So considering reality, the reality is really this. At the same time that we see a rise in the birth rate through the baby boom, we're going to see a rise in the number of women who are desiring and accessing forms of birth control. The Supreme Court decision, Griswold v. Connecticut, Griswold with a G, Griswold, Griswold versus Connecticut, is going to rule, in fact, that there is this thing called the right to privacy, that it's part of the penumbras, these shadows of the U.S. Constitution, and so women have a right to access birth control, which is going to then lead, as many predicted it would, to this culture of sexual liberation. It's easier to enforce norms, sort of sexual mores, when there's this really easy way to tell if people have been sleeping around, right? You have these babies out of wedlock, and that's sort of scandalous. But with birth control, it's not quite as big of a problem. And so we're going to see some changes in the undertones there. Like I told you, as we move into the late 50s, so the first baby boomers are born in 1945, right? So as we move into the late 50s, we're going to see the rise of that teen culture, rock and roll, this challenging authority. God bless teenagers, but you just can't do what your parents say, right? And so we are going to, new music, new forms of dancing, those kinds of stereotypes. And of course, we can't sweep these racial challenges under the rug for long, right? So we're going to begin to see more and more protests, especially within the Mexican-American and African-American communities, which we'll talk about tomorrow. And although we do see this push to get women out of the workforce, it doesn't last long. There is this consciousness that was raised within the Second World War that women can and should perhaps have something to do outside of their home. And so we're going to see more and more women pushing into the workforce, first in sort of low-level positions and then making it to the end. I'm just going to finish. That was our movie there. But so McCarthyism is going to be another way to enforce the sort of homogenization of society. You don't want to stand out. McCarthy is in the Senate, but you have read about, and I'm sure you know, about the House Un-American Activities Committee. It's important you separate them, please. McCarthy is a senator, and the House Un-American Activities Committee, the people who are doing the communist witch hunts in Congress, that's the House Representatives. So McCarthy starts the movement, but the actual push, the actual hearings to try and find out who's a communist and who's not, the blacklisting of the Hollywood 10, all of that business, that's done in the House. So just be careful not to get those two confused. And you guys, of course, have read about the Beats. Yes? Nod your heads? Good. So there is this early counterculture. It's very much underground, but it exists. There you go. Now we're done.